The Paladin is a staple of virtually all fantasy settings, and Eora, the world of Avowed and Pillars of Eternity, is no exception to this. If you're at all familiar with the concept of the Paladin from fantasy, then you probably would assume a few things about the nature of paladins in the broadest sense. He is a knight in shining armor, an embodiment of law and good, a servant of a just and righteous deity, and he must adhere to a strict code of honor. That, of course, would be the trope, and what most people are accustomed to. But in many, if not most ways, the paladins of Eora are somewhat different from the trope, cool as that might be in other settings. Paladins of Eora are not simply beacons of light and righteousness, but rather exponents of a particular ethos and set of principles. Sometimes such principles may well fall in line with a classic fantasy depiction of a paladin, but more often than not, they do not. One of the biggest differences is that paladins of Eora do not gain powers from a deity, even if they are a follower of a particular deity. Instead, they gain them from their own belief in and devotion to a cause, something they have in common with priests, which will be a topic for another time. How this works is somewhat mysterious, but willpower and devotion seem to be able to accomplish some very impressive things in the context of Eora, as indicated by the Death Guard undead, which, as I had explained, usually has its origin in the form of a paladin that, by sheer willpower, cheats death. Needless to say, paladins follow a particular set of ideals and ideas, which in terms of restrictions and gameplay are often expressed in the form of dispositional preference. If you have checked out my previous video on disposition, you would know that disposition in this context reflects personality traits and tendencies rather than overt moral or ethical axioms. Usually a paladin will have 2 favored dispositions and 2 disfavored, with the rest being neutral and without impact. A paladin that exemplifies his favored disposition will be more powerful than a paladin who does not, and much more powerful than one who personifies the opposite of what his paladin order requires of him. And not too dissimilar to many fantasy settings, the world of Avowed has paladin orders that pursue specific ideological goals. Unlike many settings where the paladin orders are usually ushered in by affiliation with a church, paladin orders of Eora have a much more diverse origin and varied history, with each being unique to the order in question. Paladins all share certain potential abilities that might overlap with some of the more conventional ones from other settings, such as the laying on of hands, but also have others that are less familiar, such as the ability to channel their will into a flaming weapon, or branding enemies with a coronating flame, making them more vulnerable to attack, as well as general enhanced defense and resistance based on how strongly they exemplify their order's tenets. Perhaps the most feared paladin order of Eora is the Bleak Walkers, as they embody the principles of pitiless war, without any concern for mercy or compassion. Their favored dispositions are aggressive and cruel, whilst their disfavored dispositions are diplomatic and benevolent. The Bleak Walkers are effectively mercenaries, but their origins are more complex than that, and rooted in a philosophical principle called bleak war. The origins of this paladin order go back to one Matlock, an Ixal-Middle philosopher general, who believed that ethical and moral considerations during warfare were unnecessary. The imposition of codes and strictures beyond the execution of quick and brutal war are reflections of civil codes of conduct that have no place on the battlefield, since they needlessly extend suffering, thus achieving the opposite of what they purport to seek to do. Bleak Walker ranks consist of soldiers dedicated to conducting warfare mercilessly and with extreme brutality in order to bring a swift end to conflicts. Because they are renowned for their terrible and unyielding nature, most employers will only call upon them as a last resort. The Bleak Walker's behavior reinforces cruelty, because the quickest resolution to a battle is one in which the Bleak Walker's arrival is announced and a surrender immediately follows. To ensure that people understand that no mercy will be given by Bleak Walkers, they avoid any dealings where they could be seen as merciful, and never give any quarter under any circumstances. Bleak Walkers won't call off an attack even if their so-called employer asks them to. They seek to embody the principles of bleak war under any and all circumstances, pursuing purposeful violence without any concern for morality. If there were a paladin order most different to the Bleak Walkers, then it would have to be the Kind Wayfarers, exemplars of kindness and giving, and protectors of travelers and the common folk. What the Wayfarers lack in prestige, they make up for in fervor for their cause. Generosity and compassion are the hallmarks of the Kind Wayfarers, and their favored dispositions are benevolent and passionate, whilst their disfavored are deceptive and cruel. Kind Wayfarers lack the regimented rules and restrictions of many paladin orders, and tend to roam freely through the land, following their own conscience as it informs them. Though the order is not known for being particularly wealthy, in recent years they've improved their finances by traveling, something they do anyway, and lending their services to cartographers to help develop travel guides for lesser-known parts of Eora. Of all the paladin orders, none is as mercantile and dependable as the Gold-Packed Knights. Pure mercenaries, the Gold-Packed Knights are driven by basic principles of order, duty, and stoicism. Their favored dispositions are, unsurprisingly, rational and stoic, and their disfavored dispositions are passionate and aggressive. The Gold-Packed Knights are an order of mercenary paladins who sell themselves for all sorts of defensive and offensive engagements. Unlike the Bleak Walkers, Gold-Packed Knights are not especially brutal or cruel and are willing to shift direction based on the desires of their employers. As their name suggests, the Gold-Packed Knights believe payment forms a binding contract. In fact, amongst the Gold-Packed Knights, there is a principle sometimes referred to as the coin bond, the devotion to the pact or contract forged by coin, believed in with near religious fervor by some. They are known for being non-judgmental, professional, and impressively mirthless and passionless in their dealings. The only paladin order with any direct ties to a deity is the Steel Garrote, whose order is founded upon devotion to Boudica, the goddess of law and justice. As might be expected, they exist to enforce the principles of Boudica, enforcing contracts and her will in Eora. Their favored dispositions are rational and cruel, and their disfavored dispositions are diplomatic and benevolent. They work with powerful individuals and business interests to hunt down those who violate contracts, especially if said contracts were endorsed by a priestess of the exiled queen. As indicated, they work closely together with the priesthood of Boudica, in the sense of acting as the body of the faith, whereas the priesthood acts as the mind. The Darkozy Paladini are the oldest paladin order in the world, that we know of at least, harking back to Grand Valia over 2,000 years ago, where they acted as palace guards. Their favored dispositions are clever and passionate, and their disfavored dispositions are cruel and stoic. Since the shattering of Grand Valia, the Darkozy Paladini have transformed into the protectors and ambassadors of the immense Darkozy family, as well as the old Valian culture. The Darkozy Paladini are widespread, and occasionally even come into conflict with each other due to the machinations of the Darkozy family. Paladins of the order are renowned for their wit and love of life, but are often seen as being reckless and unserious. Of all the paladin orders that most resemble the traditional fantasy image of the paladin, the Shield-Bearers of St. Elka might come closest. The Shield-Bearers of St. Elka are a paladin order of Adeiran warriors who emphasize honesty and diplomacy over cruelty and aggression. Their favored dispositions are diplomatic and honest, and their disfavored dispositions are aggressive and cruel. They are well known for their skill in negotiations. The Shield-Bearers were founded in honor of an elven noble who helped unite the Adir and Kulkin kingdoms after a long war. Most famously, she suffered a wound that eventually claimed her life, but succeeded in a diplomatic affair whilst her guards had only their shields to protect her. By far the most political of all paladin orders are the Fremas Mescansuolis, or the Brotherhood of the Five Sons, and they are a paladin order that serves the Valian republics. The Five Sons refer to the 5 Valian Duke Bells, or so-called Great Dukes. The Brotherhood is loyal to the collective will of the Ducal Congress, rather than to any particular duke, and members are forbidden from active intervention in the Congress's debates. They might be viewed as the military arm of a government, enforcing the will of the Great Dukes that rule the Valian republics and oversee its affairs, though it is not clear what their principles are or what their favored dispositions are either, as their sole purpose is obedience and service to the Valian republics. As always, thank you for tuning in. More to come. And do leave a like, comment, share, and subscribe, and I will check you out next time. Take care.